Eno.
What happens when we die? What are UFOs slash UAPs? Are we really living in a hologram?
Hello, and welcome to the 1000th edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno, coming to you live from WOON AM and FM radio in Woonsocket, Rhode Island, on the Paranormal Radio app from TalkStream Live, on YouTube and via TuneIn.com. I'm Ben, and that was Paul, and we welcome you to not just our 1000th show, but our 15th anniversary broadcast. So, we will get right into it and give you a little description here. On our panel today, we have four legends who have helped us build up this show over the years. And coming to us via Skype are three renowned authors, lecturers, investigators, and including astronomer Mark D'Antonio, educator and in-depth UFO researcher Kathleen Martin, and British consciousness researcher Anthony Peake. And with us in studio today is scientist and experiencer Matthew Moniz. And you've seen them all as on-camera experts on TV, and you've heard them often on our show.
Well, everyone, welcome, a very warm welcome to Behind the Paranormal. We have all been before.
Yes.
So we've had a slew of listener questions for today's show, which is titled Ultimate Questions. We boiled down the 5 most frequent questions, and we'll pose these one by one, and our panelists will answer in turn. Number 1, the most common question we received: what happens when we die? Now, Anthony Peake already knows the answer to this, but he's going to have to wait his turn. So we'll start alphabetically. Mark D'Antonio, what say you?
Well, having done that already, I had a very strange experience when that happened to me. It was 8 years ago when I had surgery went sideways, and I had 8 strokes on the operating table. No one ever caught them, and so I woke up in a coma as a quadriplegic and profoundly blind. Okay, however, before that and during the surgery, I had been whisked away to New Mexico with my mother's Native American ancestors. And I had a very strange experience with them, and they told me that the only way I was going to survive was to listen to them. And I said very, very nasty, bad things to them the whole time. So the question is, what happens when you die? To me, it means something more than just, well, maybe we just start again, or, well, then I go back to the universe, or whatever. I think that there's more to it than that. And I don't know, Paul, if science will ever break the veil of life and death. And Douglas Trumbull, a very good friend of mine until he passed a couple of years ago, did a movie called Brainstorm, in which they actually looked at video of the people just before they died, and they transitioned with them to that other side. And that was the movie. It was a very interesting movie, very, very profound for the time. And don't know if he got it right, all right, but I do know that there has to be more. I feel there was, especially from my experience, definitely more to it.
Okay, Kathleen Martin.
Well, I am very interested in this question. I've done some research, and I'm also a quantum healing hypnosis practitioner. And as such, I do past life regressions with individuals and have had my own past life regressions as well. And most people in hypnosis end up sort of floating around in some kind of dark space, and there might be colors that come in before they reach the point to where they're going. I'm very interested in life between lives, but I have not studied that. But I've read about it. And people apparently end up, the consciousness, of course, leaves the physical body, and they end up elsewhere. And some think that the consciousness is always located in that other location, and then just part of the consciousness leaves when they enter the physical body. And that sounds reasonable to me. But in this new place that you go to, reportedly, we meet with our soulmates from this planet, and we go through a review of our lives. And not somebody else judging us, but we're judging ourselves. And we can no longer have secrets because everything is revealed. And it is a learning experience. So we go through these learning experiences for, time is different. Time is not the way it is here. So who knows how long it is here, but some people can choose to come back to repay karmic debts, for example. And or you can remain there. You can come back when you want to, in order to attempt to live a better life than you did previously. Now, I'm wondering if perhaps when a person dies, their thoughts influence what happens. And the reason I say that is that I've learned to move beyond the physical, in a sense. And when my father died, we were very close. I was awake. In fact, I was getting up out of bed during the night and walking into the kitchen to try to make this end. I'd never had an experience like this before, but I found myself, every time I closed my eyes, I was in a cavern with my father in a long line of men who were pale and old and just waiting with him. And finally we came to the end of the line, and there was sort of a man in a long white robe with long hair and a beard. And he was sort of like a gatekeeper. And he said, "Can you vouch for this man?" And I said, "Yes, my father was a wonderful person. He never heard him say anything bad about anyone. He did wonderful things for the community, etc." And he opened sort of the gate, which was the sky ahead, and my father just whooshed through. And so I'm wondering if that was my father's consciousness superimposing on my own, and that these were my father's religious beliefs, perhaps. And somehow I became entangled in that. It was a very strange experience. I don't have the answers for it, but that's what I know about what happens when we die.
Excellent. Matthew Moniz.
Okay, I can explain what happens scientifically, what happens in the body. You know, the body is electrochemical in nature, and basically what winds up happening is those processes stop. Now, Einstein says energy can neither be created nor destroyed, only changed. And we are only an imprint of our own energies. And getting more like to what Kathy was putting into, you create your own frequency, and then that frequency is now moved on into another state. And I myself have done things like remote viewing, and I did it for fun, and I also did it for other organizations that will remain nameless. And I had a personal experience similar to like what Kathy explained with her father. My mother died in 2001, and she died very rapidly. She was diagnosed with cancer on like August 15th and then died September 3rd. Very, very fast moving cancer. And when she died, I went back to my house, and several friends had greeted me to provide condolences, and my phone rang, and it had a weird series of letters and numbers, not like a regular caller ID. So I answered it, and I heard my mother's voice say, "I'm okay, Mac," and then it just ended. And she used to call me Mac Attack, and whatever. So that was like energy being used to communicate through an electronic device. Now, this is not the first time I've heard of things like this. I've been doing paranormal research for decades, and I've heard of other people actually receiving, crisis calls, or kind of like what they're called. And I think Kathy's right. The person that has passed on is tuned into that person's frequency and somehow tapped into it and allowed her to share what that particular energy was experiencing. Yeah. What happens when we go on? Like I said, our energy just moves on. The physical body is just material. It's just atoms. Energy is for pretty much forever, unless when you're talking about entropy, when it spreads out beyond a point where it's cohesive. But yeah, we all got to go somewhere.
Okay, Anthony Peake.
Well, I suppose I'd first start off with the phone calls from the dead idea. And there's an associate of mine, Dr. Cal Cooper, that's been working on this for many years. And I've come across one or two very interesting points of view in terms of this. And a few years ago, I wrote a book with Irvin Laszlo on this very subject. And I think the phone calls from dead were the one things that really intrigued me, particularly taking into account that somebody told me a particular interesting story about somebody who received a delayed phone call from somebody whose phone had been destroyed in a car crash that the person had been killed in. But I think what we have to do here is we have to start doing the science. I mean, for many, many years, we've just got anecdote after anecdote after anecdote. And as the famous statement says, the plural of anecdote is not proof. Now, it doesn't mean that these things don't happen to people. It doesn't mean that they're not subjective experiences. But for me, the question is, well, what is really happening at the point of death? And we have to look at the neurology, we have to look at the neurophysiology of it. We have to look at exactly what is taking place in the brain at the point of death, because there is still absolutely no evidence that consciousness can survive outside of a working brain. So the question we have to ask is, well, are we looking at the wrong subject? And my approach has always been to look at the different. And my approach has been, I think that the most important area to take into account here is time and the subjective experience of time and the way in which time seems to dilate during near-death experiences. For instance, we know from the Moody traits, we know from the Grayson traits, which are the standard typologies that medical people use when somebody has a near-death experience. We have the idea of the panoramic life review. We have the idea of floating out of the body, out-of-body experience. We have the idea of time dilation. We have the meeting of the being of light. These are various typologies. Now, in my research and my writings, what I've said is, what are these things telling us? If we put them together, what kind of picture are we coming to here? And I argue that at the point of death, what actually happens is that the brain is flooded with a series of neurotransmitters. And I particularly argue, I initially used to argue that it was glutamate, because we know that glutamate is the major neurotransmitter of the mammalian brain. But effectively, over recent years, and after researching with, working with some top researchers here in the UK on the role of dimethyltryptamine within the brain, and also the effects of dimethyltryptamine, I argue that what takes place is that the pineal gland synthesizes from dimethyltryptamine, or from melatonin within the pineal gland, endogenous dimethyltryptamine. And it is this which actually brings about the near-death experience. It also brings about the slowing down of time. Now, again, research has been done with similarities between a particular drug called ketamine and the near-death experience, and the parallels are incredibly close. So here we have a scenario that there's something curious happening in the brain. And I'll give a couple of examples of recent research that's been done in this area that should be worldwide news and hasn't been. There's a lady called Jimo Borjigin at the University of Michigan. And they discovered in the pineal gland of live rats DMT. So it's the first time that DMT has been discovered in a mammalian brain. But also, even more amazing, was something that took place around about two or 3 years ago in Germany, where almost the golden standard took place, where a gentleman had injured himself. He'd fallen off a ladder, and he was taken to hospital. And while he was tied up to an fMRI scan, I think, or it could have been a PET scan, he died. So for the first time, there was an opportunity to see what happens in the dying brain. And again, very few people know about this. It's absolutely extraordinary as the way people do not know about this. And what they discovered was, and Borjigin has discovered this with her rats as well, is that immediately after death, within a few seconds, the whole brain fires up. The whole brain lights up, and it's acting non-locally. Now, I argue that the non-locality that's taking place in the brain is to do with the glial cells. In other words, we think that communication across the brain takes place neuronally. using neurotransmitters. But the evidence now seems to be that the world works on, forgive me on this, Kathleen, real quantum physics, not quantum healing and everything like this, real quantum physics. The idea that non-locality exists within the brain, and that there's an immediate communication between the glial cells within the brain, and the whole brain fires as if it's recreating what is known as the panoramic life review. And I argue that the panoramic life review is where the clue lies about what really happens to human consciousness at the point of death. We go into what the Tibetan Buddhists call the bardo state. When we go into the bardo state, panoramic life review takes place. And the panoramic life review is actually experienced in real time, not in my life flashed before my eyes, but my life literally was a minute-by-minute recreation of my life. Now, again, if we apply the quantum mechanics to this, we know that the act of observation or the act of measurement collapses a statistical wave function into a point particle. Now, if this is the case, it means effectively that the act of observation creates the world around you. And in my books, I talk a lot about perception studies, how vision works and everything else as well. And it is self-evident that what is taking place here at the point of death is that we live our lives again. And we live our lives again and we're going to be talking about this later on, and I'm going to be interesting, Mark, to have your opinion on this in terms of the holographic universe and the role of black holes, the role of entropy. But the other point that I think is profoundly important here is to check out the work of Max Tegmark, who is a physicist at the University of Princeton. I think he's Swedish. And a few years ago, he came up with a thought experiment called the quantum suicide experiment. And in the quantum suicide experiment, which is virtually identical to the model I put forward, which I call cheating the ferryman, he puts forward exactly the same idea. If we apply quantum physics and the implications of Schrödinger's cat and the collapse of the wave function, you cannot die ever in your own universe. You are immortal within your own universe. You see other people die because you fall out of time, in which case you never get to the point of death, and you go into this simulation, what my associate, Dr. Andrew Gallimore, calls an instantation. And Andrew Gallimore and I were both speakers at Contact in the Desert last weekend, and we shook up a lot of trees there because the things we were talking about were quite radically different to the normal viewpoint of what UFOs are and everything else as well. So the model, I argue that life doesn't end. It doesn't end because you continue. You continue as you. And again, your point, Kathleen, about life review, the idea of living previous lives as other people. I can explain that as well, which we don't have time to explain here, but it's to do with the levels of consciousness, and it's to do with an application of the Jungian collective unconscious and the idea that we're all one single consciousness experiencing it subjectively.
Okay, Ben?
Oh, how am I supposed to follow that? Well, I'll do my best. Well, English is a terrible language, and
I make my living with English. Give me a break.
Well, me too, because I'm speaking English now. But there's a really fascinating thing that the English language likes to do, which is try and take other words from other languages and distill the concept into one word. Love, time, all this stuff. And I think one of the really interesting things about time is that the Greeks had a really interesting idea about that. They had two words for time. Instead of just, one linear thing, there was kairos and chronos. Chronos being chronological time, how we experience it, and kairos being time outside of time, or some would call it God time, or whatever, which would be the time in which the gods would do whatever they were doing. So it didn't really make sense in a linear fashion, right? So when you look at things mythologically, you're like, well, when did Zeus come down and, destroy people's lives and whatever? And it's like, well, it's happening, but in a different way of time, right? It's all happening now, and it isn't, right? So the layers of how reality worked, they all happened at the same time. The political, the economic, the anthropological, the mythical, all of it was happening at once. And there's a really interesting thing that happens, and I'm going to bring up a personal experience. We don't like those, but we're going to bring that up. So a few years ago, I attended a funeral for someone I cared about very dearly, and my father was there as well. And the funeral was in the Eastern Orthodox Christian Church. And they do things very differently. So instead of, having a funeral mass or whatever, or a memorial service, they have basically the casket set up in the middle of the church, and it's facing the altar. Everybody gathers around it, but they leave a space in the middle. And essentially what happens is a trial. And the theological concept is that we're all attending this person's, quote unquote trial. It's a bad English word because it's not really what it is, but it's the closest we're going to get. Because effectively it's an experience of experiencing this person's transition with them. And the whole point of it is it's not really so, it's really for the deceased, but also for us. And it happens in sort of three different parts. And the first part really, the priest comes over next to the casket and he starts whispering some stuff towards the casket, and while the choir sings loudly so that nobody can hear what's being said. That's kind of the whole point. It's not really meant for us. And then it shifts to the rest of the people there as sort of this whole experience with this person. And the idea is that the deceased transitions into a different form of time, or a different sort of, moving from chronological time, into kairos. And then what happens there, nobody really knows. There's ideas, there's whatever, but they never really define what happens. But we do know that there is a shift in how one experiences things. And there's no mention of, well, they just disappear. You put them in the ground, they're done. It's, well, you'll see them later, eventually, whenever that is. But the idea is that you switch from one point of time into another. And what happens from there, it's like, you can have a vague estimate. There was one guy that had an idea of, there's these aerial toll houses that, you need coins for. It was a whole thing. But the idea is still not too different from Anthony's, albeit with theological language. The idea is that how we experience things, ultimately, it comes down to the subject-object problem and how we experience the world around us. And I've been really messing around with Charles Taylor recently, a Canadian philosopher, who talks about the idea of the buffered self versus the porous self. So the porous self being this idea of sort of pre-modern thinking, where the sort of delineation between the self and your environment is sort of porous. Things kind of go in and out of it. Where you end and where the world starts, there's not really a clear border. How you interact with the world around you, it's like it's a give and take, an ebb and flow. And the buffered self is the modern way of thinking, where we put up a wall between us and the world, and we step back and we observe and we calculate, we take it apart, and we do it exerts a form of control, in quotes. And effectively, when it comes down to this experience, it's sort of a rubber meets the road kind of thing for all of us in a way, because we take all these things that we've been researching for a majority of our lives. For me, since the beginning of my life, thank you, Father, for that.
You're welcome.
And in a sense, it all kind of goes out the window, right? Especially when you're the one that's laying there, or burned, or what have you, whatever your preference is. Made taxidermied, maybe, who knows, But at the end of the day, it's still, we can learn all we want about it, but at the end of the day, it's still a human experience that we all are going to have one way or another, the great equalizer, if you will. And there's a really funny little icon that was in our house growing up that I always like to point out to people, because people look at it and like, oh, that's really dark. And it's an icon of Saint Zozios. And he digs up, he somehow finds Alexander the Great's grave, and he goes to the grave, and he's like, oh boy,
I wish he told somebody where it was, because nobody's sure.
Well, I mean, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter because he's dead. So but he goes to the grave, and he looks at it, and he's like, wow, this is Alexander the Great, the conqueror, the emperor of the Greeks. He conquered all these things. He was considered like the pinnacle of human achievement. He did all these things. He made everything very confusing for civil engineers by naming every city after himself. But at the end of the day, it didn't really matter, because his empire still crumbled, and he disappeared. We still know his name, right? He lives on in name, but at the end of the day, what did his achievements do? Made things very confusing for civil engineers and historians. So, here we are talking about what happens, and I think the closest we're going to get is Anthony Peake's explanation. But, here we are, and we're really not going to know until we get there, I suppose.
Well, on that cheery note, we're going to just identify what people are listening to. It's Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on WOON 1240 AM, 99.5 FM in New England's beautiful Blackstone River Valley. And we don't want to belabor any of the questions, so I'll just comment by asking a few more questions. whenever I hear the question, what's going to happen when I die, or where am I going to go, or when am I going to go, I always ask the opposite question: where were you before you were conceived? It's all about, in my opinion, time, consciousness, individuality, what's the nature of any of those things, and it does seem to be rather personal. My only, that I can recall, near-death experience was when Ben was a baby, and I had a pneumonia and AFib going on, didn't realize it. Well, the AFib was pretty obvious, but the rest, and all of a sudden, everything faded, and I had the most incredibly vivid, more real than real, vision, or if you want to call, of a lizard or salamander sticking out of a man-made cave with these incredibly brilliant colors that I can't even describe. Now, just fast forward like, I don't know, 40 years, and we had a guest on the show who said, "What was it? You?"
Yeah.
Oh, it was Matt.
Look at that.
Yeah.
You can corroborate the story.
Yes.
Yeah. That is a well. Tell me.
It's an Aboriginal creation myth. The Aboriginal in Australia, that is one of their creator gods, and it is a multicolored salamander that lived in a.
I think I would have known that, having been in Australia, rubbed elbows with the Aborigines. But anyway, I'll leave it at that, and we'll move on to our second.
Well, before we do that, we should
Yeah.
perhaps take our commercial break.
I thought we just did.
No, we did not.
Okay, sorry about that. Another 15 years, maybe I'll get it right.
Well, hey, radio is one of those things. It's a mystery, and we all do our best to try and figure it out. But you are listening to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on our 1000th show here on WON, AM and FM, and we'll be right back.
Fresco Italiano, a Night of the Arts, returns to the St. Anartan Cultural Center on Saturday evening, June 24th at 5 p.m. The evening will feature professional artists, an art competition by the Northern Rhode Island Council of the Arts featuring students from Woonsocket and Cumberland high schools, and a delicious Italian buffet served under the center's magnificent fresco paintings. Tickets are available at Belos Flowers, Creative Impressions, The Honey Shop, Timeless Antiques, and Vos True Value Hardware. For more information and menu, visit the St. Anartan Cultural Center website.
You can depend on us for public service, ON Radio.
Welcome back to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno here on our 1000th show and 15th anniversary all at the same time. Couldn't have planned that better myself. And it just kind of happened that way, which is also a lovely, lovely time. So we will hop right back in, and I'll kick it right over to you, Dad.
Okay, our second ultimate question. Are UFOs/UAPs alien visitors, time travelers, enlightened masters, tricksters, or all or none of the above? Mark, we'll start with you.
That's a great question because I've often wondered all of those things myself. One of the things that I've discovered is that for aliens to ply the massive gulf between the stars, they're going to have to figure out a way to avoid actually going that distance. They can't go that distance, so they have to use something else. And that something else might live in the realm of more dimensions. Now, we go down the realm of thinking, oh, it's just science fiction. Except that the lecture I've been doing around the country lately has to do with what's called the Kaluza-Klein hypothesis. And Anthony knows, he's nodding. And one of the things that I think is important is to understand that when we look at another person, we don't expect them to just go invisible. That's science fiction, right? However, that's something that happens on our universe. I'm going to call it our membrane, because in the string theory world, that's what we're talking about. We're talking about X, Y, and Z all moving through time, 4 dimensions. But did you know there's 5th dimension as well? And in a particular variation of string theory called Randall Sundrum 1, that fifth dimension, called the bulk, like bulk produce, is actually highly warped. And if you can transition into there from the four dimensions that you're normally sitting here in, as you move into that bulk, the universe is warped more and more and more the farther in you go. And this brings everything closer, so that now distances are vastly shortened. So you could, and a Stanford physicist calculated this, not me, you could travel, for instance, to Alpha Centauri in the equivalent of a 20-minute drive, okay? Because you're punching out of our membrane, all right, to the bulk that's highly warped, and you punch back in more closer to Alpha Centauri. You do that a few times to get there. So it's a repeatable process. Now, how does that happen? How can that even happen? Well, I think, and to shorten this all, there's certain particles you can generate called Kaluza-Klein particles, and they're actually, in this construct, they're gravitons. Now, Anthony was talking about wave functions and so forth. All the quantum particles that we know can be described as either a particle or a wave. You can have wave functions for particles. You can have wave for light and particles of light known as photons. We know about waves of gravity. We've never found the graviton yet, right? It's elusive. However, based on physics and the understanding of the universe, it appears there's probably a counterpart particle. Now, CERN is actually building another accelerator right now, and in part, one of the things they're going to investigate, big surprise, are Kaluza-Klein particles. Okay? Now that's important because we show now that CERN is taking an interest in these particles. Meanwhile, Lawrence Livermore, all right, in recent months, had a breakthrough with fusion. Not really a breakthrough, but they actually were able to create a sustained reaction for a period of time. Now, never mind the amount of energy they put in. Creating the sustained reaction was the big takeaway here. That sustained reaction that they created points the way to being able to have a fusion reactor at some point. And guess what? If you're going to generate these particles, by the way, which are necessary to travel into that bulk, then you need something called a fusion reactor. You can generate them. And by the way, have you ever noticed that UFOs tend to be round, flying saucers, remember, or triangular? Okay. Now, why is that? I think it's because they're particle accelerators. And they're generating these particles, sheathing their ship with them, transiting in and out of the bulk in an oscillating manner. This oscillation is extremely important. So that's my feeling. Okay. So there's so much I'm leaving out. But the point being, okay, that this methodology would allow them to travel incredibly vast distances for the cost of a fusion reactor. Now, that means the likelihood just got better. Now I'm an astronomer, okay? This is what we look like, right? We wear alien shirts sometimes. But the point is, if we consider that these distant civilizations want to get here from there, the only way left, okay, the only way for them to get here is to avoid having to travel through the here to there. Okay, they have to not travel the distance. They actually have to travel around the distance. They have to get around it. The Alcubierre drive was a great idea. Miguel Alcubierre invented this in 1994. It was a tensor, it's called. And the thing is, this allows for warp drive, basically folding the corners of a piece of paper up, stepping across in that tiny gap, and then unfolding space. Now, to do that, you can imagine you need a lot of energy, and you did. All right? Even though the energy has been reduced by Sonny White at EagleWorks Labs by about 10 to the 26 in strength, that's a lot, okay? Even so, it's still a problem because the energy now that's required is the equivalent not of converting what it was before, which is the mass of Jupiter to energy, okay, but converting the mass of the Voyager spacecraft, say, to energy. That's a massive difference, but it's still out of reach for probably about 200 or 300 years. But this other thing, the Kaluza-Klein hypothesis, if true, and if string theory is true, which there's pros and cons, we could be on the precipice of a whole new interstellar exploration campaign. I'll go. Imagine going to Mars in 4 minutes. Okay, and that's you're avoiding light speed if you can do that, all right? So, because there's no speed limits out in the bulk. You can just punch out and punch in. And incidentally, last thing I'll say, every visual observation reported of UFOs, they shimmer and flicker, they disappear, okay, and they reappear over here. Every one of those can be explained with the use of Kaluza-Klein gravitons. Every single observation. However, I'm an astronomer. Something flickering and changing color, I can call it atmospheric scintillation. A star near the horizon does that. Sirius, brightest star in the sky, will do that. It'll change red and orange and blue. It looks great, right? So it goes on. And the autokinetic effect, not being able to focus on one particular spot in an empty sky, well, that could explain why people think things disappear here and reappear over there, because their eyes are doing this all the time, all right? That's fine. So in any case, we can explain it other ways, but we can't ignore the possibility that these are also Kaluza-Klein gravitons.
Okay, Kathleen Martin.
I come from a different perspective because my background is in social science, so I do social research and experimentation. My perspective is from the human experience. And as a result of these years of research, and also being the niece of Betty and Barney Hill, I was 13 when they had their experience, I have had the opportunity to obtain information from sort of the inside, people who interact with these non-human entities. And I've also interacted with them myself, being taken without permission, being taken by other people's entities, and being in contact through experimentation, where a team of researchers and I were met with a man, Kevin Briggs, for a couple of years, once a month, and were able to use scientific instruments in order to measure an increase in temperature in the room, and it varied depending upon the dimensions that these entities were from. I've also had the unfortunate experience of having these negative lower vibrating entities nearby and having one come into my environment and try to attach to me. So a lot of this is from personal experience and observation, but also with the use of scientific instruments that will measure these things. When these, they called themselves ETs, I don't know if they really were or not, came into our environment, each of us researchers felt a very strong tingling sensation in their presence. We didn't expect this. We didn't know that the other individual was experiencing this when we were. But these entities explained to us that everything is in the different dimensions depends upon the rate of vibration and consciousness. And so the way I've come to view this is that, yes, we do have various dimensions and life in these various dimensions. I don't know if it's here, that it's all around us, or if these entities are actually coming from dozens or hundreds or millions of light years away. But there is something highly perplexing. They are here. I've seen them. I've worked with 5,000 experiencers on these various studies. In addition to that, I'm a UFO investigator and researcher. So I had the opportunity to talk to many, many people about these experiences. We know that these entities that come through sometimes appear to use technology, whereas in other cases, they're just sort of popping in to our dimension, and they can be as startled as we are when we see them. So it appears not to be intentional, whereas sometimes it does appear to be intentional. The thing that is most perplexing to me is that, we have the negative, lower vibrating entities that can attach to lower vibrating people. We have the higher vibrating entities, but in between, we have those scientists who are taking people to craft, who are doing their own scientific studies on humans. And so it's not this, negative or highly positive, but it's something in between. And there are a variety of entities that are most prevalent, maybe 7 different types that are most prevalent, doing these experiments and interacting with human experiencers. And there seems to be intent there and a scientific program that's taking place. So I think that, probably all of these things exist, but I don't think they're all precisely the same.
Okay.
My opinion.
All right. Thank you. Matthew Moniz.
All right. My answer is all of the above, and maybe a few things that we haven't even thought of or discovered yet in this. Now, as a scientist, I agree with Mark. The distances an entity would have to travel are immense, and the energy it would take to traverse that distance is incredible. There's one thing in physics that and I think Mark will agree with this, that is pretty fascinating. It's called spooky action at a distance, where 2 particles reciprocate over distance, and the distance makes no difference how far the distance is. I'm wondering if there is somehow some sort of connection that is made with that, and I think Mark's theory is pretty sound. But one of the other things I definitely know from my personal experiences is there are definitely physical beings, because I've encountered them physically, had physical contact with them, aka got into a fight with them. But and I've had other people with me, and so I know that they saw the same thing, I saw the same thing, and we both corroborated what happened during that experience, or series of experiences. Now, as a ghost hunter or paranormal investigator, I've run into what people would call demons or angels in other cases. Are they alien? By definition, yes. They're not human born per se, but do they exist in our realm consistently? No. I think they exist in another realm outside of our space-time that we're stuck in. And I think it goes to something like what Kathleen was saying. Your level of consciousness will also allow you to be able to interact with them. These things choose people for reasons, and I'm talking these, I'll call them lower life forms in a sense, or more negative life forms. They choose who they want, and usually when they do something like that, it's because the person is vulnerable. I'm dealing with a particular possession case at the moment. This person was physically as well as emotionally vulnerable. Something slid in and is trying to do something. We've done some stuff to help elevate her and her feeling of her self-worth and other things, and now things have slowly, we'll call it, subsided. And the more she feels better about herself and her being, the less attacks, quote unquote, she goes through. So yeah, I do think one of each of these things is possible, as well as some things that we don't even know exist that could be happening.
Okay, Anthony Peake.
It's really fascinating, and thank you, Kathy, for sharing your experiences there, because one of the things I found quite extraordinary was when I was at Contact in the Desert, I had the opportunity to interface with quite a number of the delegates that were there. And I was intrigued at the number of them that had had experiences with entities, differing kinds from their childhood onwards. And the one thing that was consistent with all these people was their credibility. I never once for a second questioned their credibility, because they had clearly had extraordinary experiences, because they were speaking to me. It wasn't as if they were performing to anybody else. We were having a quiet chat about things. And it seems to be that people have these extraordinary encounters with non-human entities that are life-changing, but not only life-changing, they seem to go through their lives as well. And back in 2019, I wrote a book called The Hidden Universe. And in this, I was trying to understand the science of entity encounters. And when people have these entity encounters, to turn around and say they're just hallucinations doesn't answer the question. I call this the labeling theory of answers, or the idea of, or I call idiopathic science, the idea that we label everything. We give it nice big terms, preferably Greek or Latin, to confuse people, like we use the word idiopathic, which is effectively we have no idea what it is. And I think in many ways idiopathic science likes to compartmentalize anything as an hallucination. But of course hallucinations themselves are a great mystery. And of course the very great psychiatrist Oliver Sacks, in his last book on hallucinations, discussed exactly this principle. And I've spoken to physiologists, I've spoken to doctors, I've spoken to psychiatrists. Nobody knows what hallucinations are. And there's a counter argument to say that waking life is also an hallucination. So in which case, if you consider that hallucinations are brain-generated facsimile of reality, well, we're all existing in brain-generated facsimiles of realities all the time. And of course, there is this term that scientists use to describe people who think there's a one-to-one relationship between what you perceive and what is out there in external reality or consensual reality. They're actually called naive realists, and they're called naive realists for a very, very good purpose. So for me, this relationship is far more complex. And I'm always intrigued about the way in which, as a sociologist, I'm always very intrigued about the way in which the entities seem to socially reflect the societies they're manifesting in. For instance, we had, in the 1950s, we had the Nordics, and then it moved in, and they seem to follow us as if they are melding themselves in order to facilitate and support our anticipations of what they're going to be. Now, this does not mean they're not real, but what it means is they're manipulating us in some way. And in this, I'm reminded of the very famous book by Joe Fisher called The Hungry Ghosts. And it's the idea, I believe, that there is a direct relationship between entities. Entities are all the same thing. They just manifest in different ways. For instance, we have contactees. For instance, there was a very famous case way back in the 1880s, 1890s, called Imperator and Rector, where there were a group of English researchers trying to contact alien entities, which was exactly the same as what happened in Norfolk in the 1990s with the Skoll experiment, with exactly the same principles. And then we have the mystery of why it is that the aliens' technology doesn't seem to advance. I've never understood, well, I think I understand now, but I've never understood why it is that we have PET scans now. We have fMRI scans. We can look inside the bodies. We don't need to actually cut people open in order to find out how they work. Whereas the aliens seem to be doing that all the time. We can do that. We've already got the science that they haven't got. So to me, there's something more important here. And I'd say the parallels here are to do with shamanic traveling. We know that in shamanic traveling, we have something in shamanic traveling called the shaman's journey. And in the same shaman's journey, it is consistent that they have beings operate on them. They cut them open. They eviscerate them. And then we have the parallels then to the parallels that take place when people have, when they take DMT and ayahuasca. People go into an alternate state where entities engage with them. These are the same entities that people engage with in UFOs. They're exactly the same circumstances. There's research being done now at Imperial College in London, whereby there's a group, it's partially funded by the British government and it's partially funded by a guy called Anton Bilton, who's an English multi-billionaire. And the work and results, I know a number of people that are involved in this research. They are encountering entities on a regular basis, entities that recognize them, entities that they go into a DMT state, come back out from the DMT state. I mean, I'll give an example of this. One of my friends, Carl, he was one of the volunteers. He's a university lecturer. He went into the altered state of consciousness with intravenous DMT, went into a place in the DMT space. This alien comes over to him and it taps him on the shoulder and said, "You shouldn't be doing it this way." He then comes back into this reality. 2 weeks later, he's in the experimental theater again, takes the DMT, goes into the altered state. The same creature comes over and says, "I told you last time you shouldn't be doing it this way." Now that means that being was remembering him. And as he said to me, does that mean if that being was an extrapolation of my subconscious, it was telling me something I didn't want to hear? And it seemed to have anticipation. People who take DMT say that the entities, what they're called the machine elves, Terence McKenna's model of the machine elves, they're waiting for you. They're expecting you to come. So the question is, what is this big game that's going on? And I've come up with a model I call the egregorial. And Paul and Ben, this is very much based upon your work. You know, when you've told me about the experiences you've had where you've seen entities that are manifesting via plasma, you know, I argue that what the entities do is they use our anticipation of them, and then they use plasma to come through. And again, I was recently down in Jordan in the Middle East, and I was talking to people over there about the jinn, and I had the opportunity to go to some jinn caves. Sounds like a drink, doesn't it? But jinn caves actually at the back of Petra that people don't normally visit. And in these caves, the jinn is supposed to manifest. Now, in the Quran, it says that jinn were created out of smokeless fire. What's smokeless fire? It's plasma. It's another way of describing plasma. So could it be that these entities, we are co-creating these entities out of our anticipations of them, but they're just as real. So it means that at a deeper level of reality, there is this world consciousness. You know, again, what was mentioned before about non-locality and the EPR paradox, and John Bell and his calculations, and the Alain Aspect work in Paris and Dalibard. You know, this stuff, the idea that at a deeper level of reality, everything is related. Everything is super in a state of superposition, which means consciousness is in a state of superposition as well. So the entities are communicating with us interdimensionally, but not in the way we necessarily understand dimensions mathematically. You know, again, it was fascinating. Mark stuff there was just extraordinary. I think there's so many things I want to check up there in terms of Kaluza Klein. But effectively, what we need to do is to stop just going down this same old path of going about, you know, just doing the same things. We've got to do something differently. If we are going to change this paradigm, we've got to start thinking differently. We've got to start engaging the critics. We've got to start engaging the skeptics. And they're not going to believe, so we keep waffling on about the same old stories. We've got to engage them with the science. We've got to turn around and say, our science works. You can't counter our scientific model. So I think what we need here is something extremely exciting. And I think that the entities themselves may be able to help us with this. There may be some kind of cross communication. But as you said, Kathy, there are so many different levels of them. Some of them seem to be thoughtless automatons. Some of them seem to be just evil and wanting to just take people over. But other ones seem to be wanting to help us. They are extrapolations of ourselves, but they are part of us, if that makes sense. And I think once we start thinking in that way, we're then starting to put the pieces together as to what's going on. And I'd like to leave myself and a group of young academics that are now coming up are really thinking outside of the box. They're taking these things and saying, let's explain them. Let's not pretend, you know, the old science is dying. And the old science is great because without the old science, we wouldn't have this kind of communication. You know, so materials reductionist science is excellent and it's really great. But we know that goes from cosmology, we know from the discoveries of quantum mechanics, we know, and the new area, which is even more extremely interesting, is quantum biology and the things we are finding out. And one of my friends that's heavily involved in this, I can't think of his name now, but effectively, this is the future. And what we have to realize, and I'll give one final example of this. If nobody knows about this, I'm sure you do. But the Toronto experiment in 1970-71, where a group of individuals created a ghost, and that ghost became manifest.
Phil.
It's an egregore. It's a thought form that is created. And I think it's really exciting times we live, but we all need to be working together to make this happen.
Okay. Ben, we have to take a hard break, but
We
what
do.
do you...
I guess I can't really start a thought because I've been digesting everybody's answers this whole time. So I guess in the meantime, I'll do a little promo for what we're going to be talking about in the next hour. We're going to be touching on a couple of different things, including taking a little half step backwards into how time works, and if we're really living in a hologram, and if we have enough time, who or what God is. So you are listening to the 1000th show of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno, with our wonderful panel, Mark D'Antonio, Kathleen Martin, Anthony Peak, Matt Moniz, my dad, and myself, here on WOON, AM and FM radio, here in the sort of warm Blackstone River Valley. We have 84 degrees here at the corner of Park Ave and Kennedy Street. We're going to take a little step away for our legal ID, so you all know the call letters and all that good stuff, and we'll be right back in about 15 seconds. Just kidding, it's not allowing me to. So we'll give it another few seconds, and then it will allow me to. Live radio, ladies and gentlemen.
Broadcasting live and local daily from the Navigant Credit Union broadcast studio at the corner of Park Avenue and Kennedy Street in Woonsocket. This is ON, AM, and FM.
WOON, Woonsocket.
Hello, this is Manny Brando. I hope you will listen to us each Sunday morning at 8:30. I will sing your favorite songs, and my wife Virginia will organize everything.
That's right, Manny. It's the Manny and Virginia show every Sunday morning at 8:30 on ON, AM, and FM radio.
Well, look at that. It's like we're professionals. So welcome back to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on our 1000th show with our wonderful panel of guests. And I guess we can either, I don't know, we can just move on to the next question. It seems like we're taking about a half hour to answer each question, so we'll move on to the next one.
Okay, well, our next third question that was most commonly asked was, and these have to be people who listen to this show a lot, because we talk about this. How does time work? Mark D'Antonio.
Well, you have a clock, and then a second happens, and then another one happens. Time's actually a human construct. The universe doesn't know anything about time. We do, because we invented time in our minds because we wanted to chronologically order things. And so doing that means that we are just creating a methodology based on what we saw with atoms and how they vibrate, the atomic clock, okay? And based on this vibration, we devised a timing mechanism so that we know how events will progress from one. See, you can't say one moment to the next, right? You have to say how events progress. Because if we say 1 second to the next, I've already invoked time. But if you just say how events progress, then that's almost anything. It means that there's change. All right, and the change occurs over a definitive period that we're calling time. I actually don't spend too much time thinking about time travel and time. I do understand, time dilation and things relative to special relativity and general relativity, but I don't think about it in terms of my human experience in that way. So this question doesn't have as much meaning for me as the other questions so far. So I'm out of it in that case. So I would have to pass the torch.
Kathleen Martin.
Okay, well, I agree with Mark that time is non-linear the way it is here on our planet. We measure time, and the meta-analyses of our ESP studies indicate very clearly that time is not what we think it is, because we can see into the future. So that's something to think about. Also, when I think about the experiences of individuals who have been taken into what we think of as an extraterrestrial environment, one of the questions that we asked on our studies is, was there a time differential? And the average length of human time that people were missing was 2 hours, but some people were missing for several days. Other people were missing for only a few seconds, and then other people were returned to this earthly environment at an earlier time than when they were taken. So that's my perception of time, and it's another short answer like Mark's.
Okay. Matthew Muniz?
Well, from what I understand of time, my own personal view, is every moment of time has already happened. It's just our point at where we're in it that we're observing. The future has already happened, the past has already happened, and we're just stuck in some point in between. And unfortunately, time is one of these things that gets a little gray when when you're trying to answer it, because
I see what you did there.
Sorry. But basically what winds up happening is you wind up with your own observation of it. Time is relative to the observer, basically. So and what happens in it is different to each person observing it. Like, good example, a car accident that people watch. Okay? We're all experiencing the same time, but my observation of what I saw is different than what you saw when the accident happened. Okay? And then it's all up to our interpretations of it. Time itself, like I said, is already happened both in the future and in the past. So, yeah, I'm with Mark and Kathy on this one.
Okay, Anthony Peake, this is your big moment.
Okay. Around about, even saying the term really seems to seem nonsensical, really. But around about 12, 13 years ago, I wrote a book called The Labyrinth of Time. And I'm with St. Augustine on this, because St. Augustine said that if I don't think about time and people ask me what it is, I fully understand it. But as soon as you start to think about it, and as soon as you start to talk about it, it kind of crumbles, and you suddenly realize, I'm not quite sure what it is. And then we get the scenario that scientists will say it's entropy. It's a movement from order to disorder, and that's what it is. Or we have, as Mark said, we have the geometric idea of clock time. But neither of these are really time. And philosophers, scientists, have an issue with time. We know it's the fourth dimension from Einstein and everything else as well. Then we have some fascinating things that Minkowski came up with in terms of block time. But in terms of the philosophers, it becomes very, very complex. And, you start reflecting on it for a second. And for example, time is the only thing I know that is measured by itself. You can have a pound of apples and everything else as well. But you can only ever have a minute of a minute. And I have no way of knowing whether your minute is equal to my minute. Because the French philosopher, I think it was Saussure, said there are two things. There's durée and longue. And the idea that there's an inner duration and there's long, which is a different form of time. But then we have to reflect for a moment. One of the analogies, I think it was Marcus Aurelius, said that we never step in the same river twice. But if time is like a river and time flows, we have an issue here. Because what's it flowing against? If I see a river, I see a riverbank, I see a river flowing, and the riverbank is the measurement device by which I know the river flow. So how do we know that time flows, and what's it flowing against? And a comparatively famous Anglo-Irish aeronautical engineer called John William Dunn, in I think it was 1927 or 28, wrote a book called An Experiment with Time. And he used this idea, and he said, if we extrapolate from this, we have to assume there's another time called time 2, that which we measure time 1 against, if I'm making sense. So time 2 is almost the riverbank that makes us see time flowing. But then he argued that if that is the case, there must be another observer in time 2. And he called that observer 2. But of course, that then ends up in an infinite regress, because how many times have you got measuring against yourself? And, does time flow from an indeterminate future, becomes the present moment, and disappears into the past? Or is it a construct of perception? There is an interesting British mathematician called Julian Barber that in 2000 wrote a book called The End of Time. And he argued that time is not continual. Time is in slivers. And what we think is movement is in fact effectively like a cartoon, where there's a series of static images that link to each other. Now, again, there was a very interesting discovery made literally around about 3 or 4 years ago, again in Germany, where somebody suffered from what's called the Zeitraffer phenomenon, whereby he started seeing images as static images. And he realized, I know it was a lady actually, there was a lady, the Zeitraffer was subtly different, but there was a lady that actually had this particular neurological problem where she couldn't even cross a road because the car would be there, then it would be on her, and then it would go past her. So clearly there seems to be slivers of time. Now, within quantum mechanics then, we then have an issue, because what do we mean then by time? Is time quantized? Does it effectively mean that time, like matter, comes in little quanta, little packets? In which case, what are those little packets? What are the carriers of the message? Because in quantum mechanics, we have the principle and the idea that photons are the bosons. They are the energy carriers of the electromagnetic wave. So what about time being this way? The smallest bit of time you can have is called Planck time, which is the amount of time it takes a photon to cross the Planck length, which I won't go into the technicalities of this. But if that's the smallest bit of time there is it quantized? That means there's a bit of time here, and next to it, another bit of time. In which case, what's between the bits of time? So suddenly we're into these really interesting areas. And of course, we know that time and matter are the same thing. As you get closer to the speed of light, matter and energies and energy and matter start to meld into each other. So here we have some really interesting, massive conundrums of what we really mean when we talk about time. What do we mean when we talk about time dilation? When the point that was made before, and I've studied this extensively because it's a central part of my Cheating the Ferryman thesis about near death. The idea of when time slows down for an individual subjectively, what is happening there? How does that happen? What is the mechanism that brings about the slowing down of time? And again, we believe it's neurologically based. We think it's to do with certain release of certain neurochemicals in the brain that slows down time. There's some fascinating experiments being done in terms of people being dropped from a great height in a chair lift. And what they did was, as they were falling, they asked them to look at a clock that numbers were changing really quickly. And people did see the numbers changing, which seems effectively that time is relative to us. Now, this is intriguing. So, and of course, time is as somebody once said, time is the thing that stops everything always happening at once. But it's more than that. It's everything we gauge the universe by is time. Everything is gauged by time. And again, coming back to the near-death experience and what happens at the point of death, referring back, I'd argue that time is the evidence that we potentially might be immortal beings. Your time is different to my time, and it's different to everybody else's time. We live within our own subjective phaneron of time.
Okay. Ben?
Oh boy. I always have the misfortune of going right after Anthony. There's a really cool idea called pre-reflective consciousness. And the idea of it being that, we can step back and be aware of our thoughts, our surroundings, body functions, etc. It's like there's a little joke people like to do where, hey, have you ever breathed manually? And then you start doing it, and it's one of those things where you don't really think about it. It sort of correlates with the idea of how the Greeks sort of dealt with knowledge and having the different types of knowledge that we use, right? So you have episteme, scientific knowledge, technical knowledge, doxa, they considered, which was the knowledge of public opinion, et cetera, et cetera. But one of the really interesting things is, how do we engage with those, right? It's almost like you switch gears almost. It's like I put a math problem in front of you, Matt, you'll know how to do it. You just kind of like, okay, cool, yeah, I get it. All right, 2 + 2 is 4, or 5 if it's the base 2 system, etc. Right? So or if I say, all right, Matt, I want you to explain thermodynamics to me, and you'll just say, okay, yeah, here it is. Or what are the statistics in the latest political polls? You're like, oh, okay, well, here's what public opinion is, right? You'll be able to switch those and not really think about it. But then, let's say you're in a mall, right? And you're on the top floor, and you look over the edge, and you get a thought that says, just drop your phone, or jump. Intrusive thoughts, right? Where do those come from? Are they in you? Are they elsewhere? And the idea is super interesting, because this idea of pre-reflective consciousness, we are able to kind of step back and sense, oh, geez, I'm sensing the minutes going by now, the seconds, the time. I look at the clock and I'm like, wow, we've been on the air for over almost an hour and 15 minutes now. And look at that, it barely felt like it. We've powered through, 2 sort of major questions, and we're, about to power through a third one here. And I'm genuinely impressed that we have been able to do it as fast as we have, because typically, the length questions don't really correlate to how long it takes to actually answer them. So really, I guess it's kind of one of those things where I also agree with St. Augustine on this, because no one's really been able to top it at this point, right? The Confessions, oddly, it's like everyone else since then's kind of been copying and pasting without really knowing it, right? It's it's one of those things where we can try and take a step back, use pre-reflective consciousness, and be able to kind of assess it in some way, shape, or form. But at the end of the day, it's still the subject-object problem, right? We're all experiencing the object differently, right? And so it's so fascinating to try and answer, because I have a counter question if anyone wants to try and answer it. What is the purpose of time?
Well, anybody go for it.
As I said earlier on, to stop everything happening all at the same time. That I wrote when I was coming back from the States recently. I actually watched that film, everything happening all at once. If you've seen it, it's extraordinary. It's a fantastically wonderful film. But again, it just kind of shows that we need time. And we always run out of it, don't we?
Probably needs
purpose
more
is
time on the
separation.
show.
It's meant to basically measure chronological events, because humans don't have the ability to multitask and see everything at once. If we did, we may never have invented time, and the universe might look very different to us, right? Because we think, oh, that supernova, that exploded 20 million years ago. It's a supernova we're currently looking at in our remote observatory. However, what's 20 million years ago mean, okay? What does that really mean, and how is it that we say it's 20 million years ago? Well, because it's a distance 20 million light years away. That's how long it takes light to travel from here to there. It's a 20 million years, so 20 million light years, okay? A measure of time and distance all at the same time. So you see, we conflate things together too when it's convenient, and that's what we do with time. In astronomy. But you know what? We accept that there is passage of time because we see what atoms do, and we see the vibrational states of atoms. And based on the vibration within atoms, we came up with a concept of time. Now, this was something that was obviously way before they knew about atoms. Time was created, of course. But we have an atomic clock, and that turned out to be a very accurate clock based on the vibration of an atomic nucleus.
Okay.
Could also be considered a measurement of speed.
I guess so, except in Star Wars, where they say they'll make the Kessel run in 6 parsecs. That was totally wrong. And when I saw Star Wars, I went, "Oh, I can't believe that was allowed through. How could they say that?"
Okay,
Could be different laws of physics, Mark. It's a different universe.
No,
Kathy, you'd like to comment here?
I'll pass on that one.
Okay. Well, let's move on to question number 4 in our Ultimate Question series. Are we really living in a hologram? I'll throw that at Mark, and maybe Mark can briefly explain the holographic theory. So, for anybody out there who doesn't have a master's in physics.
25 words or less, please.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's not going to happen. But so I will actually not attempt to explain holographic theory. But I will say this much, though. Every time there's a science fiction movie that comes out, all right, and this can relate to something that Anthony was saying earlier. Every time there's a scientific or science fiction movie that comes out that speculates that the moon is hollow, or that we live in a tank full of gel and the aliens are stealing our energy and mining our electric fields, Matrix, okay? Suddenly that becomes what the world is to many people, all right? So I think that people generate a lot of their thoughts and theories based on some Hollywood guys that just want to make money. All right, and let's be clear. I mean, they say, "Oh, that's a cool theory. It's the Matrix, or the moon's a hologram." You know, it's like, yeah, we landed on a hologram. You know, it's like, you know, face palm. You know, so I don't think that the holographic universe holds too much water for me.
Yeah, it's essentially the idea that we're living in a computer simulation or a projection.
I don't buy that. I mean, and I think that people think that because the human brain can work like a computer and works like a computer in many ways. And we've modeled computers after how the human brain operates too. Don't forget, we invented the computers.
Right.
Okay, so a lot of that is basically creating objects based on our human experience, right? We create robots that look like humans and dogs and things we know. Okay, Boston Dynamics does this, right? Well, the bottom line here is that, you know, it has to do with everything we already know. And so when people, for instance, will see a movie that has a holographic theme to it, there are a few that will be very loud about it and vocal, and they will call this real. And I know people that are supposed to know better who actually think that the Matrix is real, and that somehow the Wachowski brothers had figured it out as the scientists they are, which they're not. So I don't know, but okay. I don't put any stock in it.
All right, Kathleen Martin.
Are we actually two-dimensional, and are we only part of a holographic projection that causes us to believe that we are three-dimensional or makes us three-dimensional? Edgar Mitchell and Rudy Shield are very interested in this, as was Ray Hernandez from the Free Organization, and now they're studying consciousness. And given that theory, if it is correct, these non-human entities might be scientists living on another distant planet in somewhere in our galaxy, or maybe in another galaxy. And they are there projecting themselves as a hologram into our environment. The difficult part for me to wrap my head around is how they can do this and be physical beings, can take humans into their environment. The humans lie on a table. The humans feel the solid flesh of these entities. They experience their presence the way that we would experience others who are human, only they're different. So are they traveling here at the speed of thought, as Rudy believes, or is this something different? It's something that I think is difficult for most of us to even wrap our heads around, not even consider in a sense. But it's interesting, but I prefer to think that something else is happening, that these entities are actually multidimensional, and that they're in our environment, and that they are able to slip through dimensions, through portals, and come into our environment or take us to their dimensional environment. Here, they don't seem to be physical oftentimes, but when we go to their environment, there is physical as anything on this planet. And so that's the way I have come to interpret what is occurring.
Okay, Rudy Schild being the Harvard astrophysicist.
Yes.
Matthew Moniz?
Yeah. Well, the way I look at it, and this may fit more into Anthony's wheelhouse, the holographic universe is actually our own brain. That's the way we're interpreting the universe. A brain creates a universe in and of itself inside the brain neurochemically. Now, I'm an analytical chemist by trade, and I work a little bit with genetic engineering and stuff like that. But what I do know is the brain is a very, very complex piece of chemical machinery, okay? And it can generate a lot of our perception of what we have in our world around us. Now, is that brain generating that reality that we see? Yes. It does generate our own perception. You know, I'm touching my phone. Is this phone really here? Or is it here because the brain is projecting something that's saying it's physical and tangible? Now, the people that are putting this forward, are they just merely modeling this after, you know, what our own brain does? I'm kind of like with Mark. I don't really buy into it being a larger construct. Not to say it couldn't be, but
Okay.
yeah.
Anthony Peake.
Okay, I'll start with the statement. Physical reality that we think is physical reality that is solid is 99.99999999996 empty space.
Yeah.
What is solid are the electrons and quarks, nothing else. Okay, there might be fields there might be sort of 0-point fields and everything else, but most of it's empty space. When we feel that we actually physically interface with anything, you never touch anything. It's called electrostatic repulsion. The electrons at the outer shells of the atoms are actually negatively charged, as are the shells or the electrons in the end of your fingers and the end of your bottom when you sit on a chair. So you never interface with anything either. So suddenly there's something rather peculiar about the nature of reality we think it is. It ain't solid. It ain't there. So what is it? So what brings it about? Max Tegmark, in his recent book, The Mathematical Universe, argued the universe at its basis level is mathematical. It's numbers. It's statistics. It's numbers, nothing more. Quantum physics has known for years about the statistical wave function. Nobody fully understands why we mean the statistical wave function. It's not a real wave function. It's a statistical wave function that literally is a mathematical construct stating whether a subatomic particle will be found in one location or another, and depending upon the size of the wave is where the particle is likely to be found. Then we have the point of view that it's consciousness or the act of measurement that collapses that wave function into a point particle in a particular location or not. So to turn around and say that, it's physically out there and it's real, it ain't. We also know from perception studies that everything is internally modeled by the brain. It's an internal model. We think there is a three-dimensional world out there that is created visually from an inverted image, postage stamp sized, at the retina. And if that's turned into an electrical signal which goes to the darkest part of the brain, the visual cortex. And in the visual cortex, it takes that signal and that small message and creates this three-dimensional world that's all around you. So that's the first point I'd like to make. The second point is that people like Waldemar de Sena, Lennon Susskind, Jacob Bekenstein would disagree the argument that there's no validity to the whole argument of the holographic universe. These are guys that argued for years about the nature of this. And somebody should tell Craig Hogan at the Perimeter Institute in Canada that he's searching for the pixelation of space. They've got scientists working for the pixelation of space. There was something found a few years ago by they were looking for gravity waves in southern Germany, and they found some fluctuations that is beyond my understanding because I'm not mathematical enough to understand it. But it seemed that this was evidence that the universe is in some way digital in its structure. So clearly here, there does seem to be, why is there something rather than nothing? Surely nature works at the most simple, and the most simple would be nothing. But there is something, And all we actually know is that we are perceiving something that's out there. Whether we look at the universe and everything, we know from mysteries of, for instance, Wheeler's delayed choice experiment can show theoretically that by the act of observation, we bring quasars into existence that are 10, 15 billion years old. And we can actually do this kind of double slit experiment with light waves going around a galaxy. Something, and we know this occurs because probably, Mark, the Einstein crosses, where you see 4 quasars, and that it's the light bending around a galaxy, which gives you the image that there's 4 quasars, when in fact there's only 1. So this proves to me that there's something much more interesting about the nature of reality. The question is, what is the interface between me as a conscious observer and the universe outside? Now, Nick Bostrom, who is a Swedish philosopher, many years ago came up with the idea that there's only some options about how humanity will pan out. And the idea is that either with looking at Moore's law, the idea that every year the amount of processing power doubles in terms of how we can create computers. There is an argument to say that as more time goes on, the computing power available to our descendants is going to be phenomenal. And now we've got quantum computing. It's going to be even more amazing because we're dealing with qubits, which are actual calculations that take place in alternate universes. So this is extremely extreme stuff. So the computing power they're going to make is huge. So what would our future generations, assuming they don't wipe themselves out, what will they do? Well, it's likely they'll create simulations, because we've already created simulations with the Sims. We also created simulation universes online. We have No Man's Sky that we've created. We have now, with virtual reality headsets, we can go into a world that literally we can walk around in an illusion of 3 dimensions, which is actually only 2 dimensions, which is created from mathematics. So when you put your Oculus Rift headset on and you're wandering around this 3-dimensional world, it's not 3-dimensional, it's 2-dimensional. It's created out of maths, zeros and ones, nothing more, nothing less. But you believe it's real because your perceptions tell you it's real. So could it be that these future generations turn around and they say, do you know what we could do? We'll invent an ancestor sim, and we'll populate that ancestor sim with our ancestors, and we will actually create sims of our ancestors. Now, I don't know enough about what's called the substrate problem. And the substrate problem is basically, if you scanned your brain, somebody scanned Anthony Peake's brain down to the subatomic level, and then uploaded that into a computer with digital information, would that be me? Would that be conscious? Would that be aware? In which case, where does consciousness come from? Does consciousness appear by the addition of one molecule, one quark, one electrical field? Spontaneously, where does it come from? So let's argue that consciousness is an epiphenomenon of brain or information fields. In which case, these beings could be sentient. If they could be sentient, they're living their lives like we're living here, and they've got no way of knowing. Remember the famous thought experiment, the brain in a vat. The idea, if you had if all your tactile feedback and your physical feedback was being fed to you digitally, how would you know? How would you have even the vaguest idea that you're living within a simulation? Or even more important, if you were living in a simulation of your life being you from the moment of your birth, how would you ever know? You couldn't. So in which case, the question is much more interesting than that in terms of its argument. And in my latest book, I discuss this in great detail, using some of the latest work. So while we go into altered states of consciousness when we have out-of-body experiences, how does that work? If we were in a simulation, it could work. If it's a simulation, you could go elsewhere. You could move within the simulation. You could fly in the simulation, lucid dreaming, these kind of things. There are all these things that need to be explained. If they are real phenomena, they need to be explained. But they can't be explained by just, it happened to me, anecdotes, bang, bang, bang. We need to do the science. I keep banging on about this. We can sit here till the cows come home. We're not going to convince anybody, any skeptic out there, unless we engage with them and say, hey guys, you're coming up with this simulation theory. You're coming up with all these ideas. do you realize that these are actually explaining the things we have been experiencing for years? You know, the Free Guys, I mean, I was in contact with them a few years ago and they wanted me to join them. And for some reason, I lost contact, which was really, really sad, because I think a lot of the stuff they were doing was absolutely incredible, you know? So what we're doing now is we're building a worldview. And I think that we are collectively creating the future by our acts of observation. We are collapsing the wave function of a new reality. And that new reality can include everything from quantum mechanics to cosmology. And I always feel, you know, cosmology fascinates me. And really, you know, sort of, Mark, I really want to talk to you more because the stuff you're saying there, I was really getting very excited about. So that's my opinion on it. I think, mind you, I do not know. I take the science and I say, well, what does this suggest? And it suggests to me that there's more to this than meets the eye. And as Mark said quite rightly, any culture will always extrapolate from its technology how the world works. We know this. We always do this. You know, the Newtonian universe was mechanistic in the way it worked. This is what we do because we can only do what we understand. But I think we're getting to the point now where we're starting to realize that the universe is far stranger than we can ever imagine. And we're just starting on a really incredible journey.
Okay. Ben, would you simulate us through our final break of the show?
Of course, I will be glad to. So you are listening to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno on our 1000th show, and we will be right back.
Hi, this is Joe Callahan, your maitre d' inside the Tiki Bar, letting you know the Tiki Bar is now open 2 days a week on ON, AM, and FM, Saturdays at noon, and a replay Mondays at 6. The Tiki Bar is sponsored by attorney Bob Lauder, the Carew Investment Group, Family Discount Furniture, and Pepin Lumber. Here's your chance to catch 1 full hour of Jimmy Buffett music inside the Tiki Bar, Saturdays at noon and Mondays at 6 on ON, AM, and FM.
We're local and live at 99.5 FM, ON, AM, and FM.
Okay, welcome back to Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno, our 1000th show. I wanted to, before we get to the God question, I wanted to ask everyone to tell us about their books, where they can find out more, websites, etc. Mark D'Antonio? And by the way, you don't know it yet, but you're going to be on the show very soon about your 2020 book, which we haven't covered yet.
Oh, well, thank you. I wrote a book called The Populated Universe, and it's actually, it answers the questions that basically most people fail to be able to answer when they're asked, do you believe there's life elsewhere and why? They'll always say, yes, I believe there's life elsewhere. But when you ask them why, then they fall back to, well, I can't believe we're alone. With so many planets out there, there's got to be more planets. Well, how about some science? We can add some science to that and talk about carbon. All life forms on the planet are carbon-based and they're bilaterally symmetric, right? So based on how our bodies are made and how much DNA is in, how DNA actually is in every single living creature, except a couple, okay, we want to consider that the book is going to take you down the path of saying, well, I believe life is out there, and here's why. And it's going to help you answer that question. So that's the book, The Populated Universe, available on Amazon worldwide. Well, then we have remote observatories that we're running. All right, I have 3 now. I have one here. Well, when that telescope goes back in, it'll be up and running again. We sold the dome because we outgrew it. But we have one in Arizona, with a second one going into Arizona in another month or 2. And basically, we run them from anywhere we are in the country or in the world. We can run them anywhere. And so as that's you can find that all on skytourlive.org or skytourlive.com. We are a not-for-profit company, and we've managed to take the science of astronomy into the public sector now, because I believe science is for everybody, and everybody should be able to understand it as long as it's spoken in terms they can understand.
Okay, Kathleen Martin.
I've written 6 books, 3 with nuclear physicist Stanton Friedman, the late Stanton Friedman, and the other 3, one with Denise Stoner, who is my partner in UFO investigations, and a couple more, one for experiencers of contact. And the latest is Forbidden Knowledge, a personal journey from alien abduction to spiritual transformation. We are, and Dr. Melanie Barton and I are working on a new study. You can go to my website at Kathleen-Marden to complete the survey. It's on religious belief and extraterrestrial life. There are 50 questions, but anyone can take part in it. The first 25 are for those who have never had this kind of experience. So hoping that you will go there, Kathleen-Marden.com. You can read where I will be speaking this year, order autographed copies of my books from my website, and they're also available in multiple formats on Amazon, Barnes & Noble.
Okay, Matthew Moniz.
Yeah, we're in our 18th year at Spooky South Coast and enjoying it. I am currently writing 2 different books, one on local ghost stories, the other on alien abduction, my personal experience in cooperation with a couple of other people's experiences. I've got, I can mention one television show that's coming up. Beyond Skinwalker Ranch, I'll be on the July 11th episode for the Bridgewater Triangle. I also will be filming something for a major network coming up. I can't mention who, but that will be dealing with alien abductions. That will probably be released towards the end of the year. And I will be speaking up at Exeter, New Hampshire this year.
Okay, Anthony Peake.
Right, I've written over the last 2 decades, I've written 12 books, and I've just started on my 13th. Book sales just in paperback version is now running about 120,000 worldwide. I have at least one book in every major, my publishers have at least one book in every major European language and a number of minor ones. And I'm now working on book 13 because my publishers have now asked me to write a book on near-death experiences in terms of really doing my approach to near-death experiences. In terms of my books, you can get my books from general bookshops worldwide. If you want to buy them on Amazon, they're there. All my books are on all formats, including Audible, which, by the way, I had to audition to read my own books on Audible, which was absolutely extraordinary. But apparently I was told I had the right kind of voice for them. And people do seem to enjoy the Audible books particularly for some bizarre reason. As my wife turns around to me and she says, "Why didn't you tell me about your theories when she can't sleep?" So if you want a cure for insomnia, just buy one of my Audible books. My books cover, the whole gamut of extraordinary human experiences, and I genuinely like to believe that my overall Uber hypothesis can explain every single unique, strange, esoteric, psychological state, from near-death experiences to out-of-body experiences. And the thing is, my starting point is always and will continue to be the science. And in my books, there are page after pages of references back to academic articles, because my approach is don't take my word for it. I don't want you to take my word for it. If you think I'm wrong, great. Just go back to the academic articles, read them, and come back to me, and I will amend my model. Because this is not about me. This is about trying to come up with a hypothesis of the human condition.
Okay. Well, we only have, our books we talk about all the time, so the less said about them, the better on this show. We have about 15 minutes left, but let's dive into our 5th and final ultimate question. Who or what is God? Mark D'Antonio.
Of course, you got to go to me.
Luck of the draw.
Luck of the draw, right? Or look of the alphabet. Right?
Yeah.
That what you just said?
Right.
Yeah, we just
See
said
what
the
you
same
did
thing.
there. Yeah.
Alpha and Omega, am I right?
Yeah, that's true. Well, you know what it is. First of all, I led with this at a conference down in Ozark. There was about 750 people in the audience, and I said when I went out on the stage, I said, how many people have thought of a person they know and they haven't talked to in like 10 years, and suddenly that person calls you right then and there? Every hand went up. Okay? And then, of course, everybody started to laugh. And I said, science would make you believe that's a coincidence. Well, it's not coincidence. It's actually something that I believe is a variation, a form of quantum entanglement, which is what Anthony was talking about earlier, quantum entanglement, and then you were as well, Matt, I believe. It's quantum entanglement, and I made up a word, the brainular level. It's between brains, okay? And I think that that's something that has not been researched very well. It's been danced around, but if we look at it from a scientific point of view, I think we'll find that human beings are linked. So what does that mean about the concept of a God? Does it mean that we are the makers of our fates? Now, I don't know the answer to that question. And even in my book, when we talk about how life developed on Earth, because we have to learn, because as an astronomer, exoplanets were a big thing for me, and I spent a lot of time studying exoplanets and learning all about them and how life could persist and thrive and grow and be supported by planets of all different kinds. And in the book, when I talk about, we talk about peptide chains and proteins, and then when we get to and it's all lay level, so everybody can understand it. But when we get to the point about life, you can only end up saying, and then life happened. Okay, sentience is something, and self-awareness and so forth happened at a certain point, and no one on this planet can tell you when that happened. And I think that that's an acceptable answer for me. I'd rather that there be some actual true mystery in the universe. But I do think if God exists, a God that I would like to see is the chief scientist of the universe, because you have to have an intimate knowledge with how everything works, from the smallest particle, if you believe in particles, or to the smallest string, if you believe in strings, okay, to be able to manage all of the componentry of this vast universe. So I know that there was the Gaia hypothesis years ago that said, Earth is alive, and don't hurt the Earth because it will respond. And, well, I think that those responses are based on, again, our feeling that we can be hurting our planet, and so the natural responses don't do that, right? But in effect, the brain has evolved to keep us out of pain and to stop us from thinking about things that may be hurtful, right? I mean, so you can't put your finger in a candle and leave it there. It'll come out automatically. It's an autonomous reflex, right? Well, in the same way, our brains will be engaged to try to figure out our fate, and we'll try to figure out where we come from, and we will mull that question over, the finger in the flame, for the rest of our lives, and not knowing just how the universe was put together. And as I said, I can't tell you what G-O-D means. Okay, backwards it's dog, and we all love dogs. Okay, well, if time flows backward, then we are worshiping the dogs. Okay, but the fact is, I can't explain what God is, if there's a God, or how we would see him. And people say, oh, well, he's everywhere. Well, no, air molecules are everywhere. The ground is everywhere. Okay, space is everywhere. But what is God? And so it really comes down to philosophy, which I have steered clear of kind of with a vengeance, because I don't want to muddy my waters with that kind of question, because it will take me away from thinking about the science in a pure fashion.
Okay, Kathleen Martin.
I think of God in terms of vibrational frequency and consciousness. And I think of God as being at the highest vibration with the highest level of consciousness, that God is the creator of all that is. Simple, short answer to the question.
Matthew Moniz.
Somewhat in agreement with Kathleen. I view God as, in air quotes here, as just creation itself. Creation is one of the permanent things that goes through our universe. Things are always in motion, being created and destroyed. The only thing that is constant in the universe is change. Things are always being changed. So I view God as the act of total creation and what it does.
Okay.
And I'll leave it at that.
Anthony Peake.
Bill Hicks, the American comedian, one of his most famous monologues, turned around and said, "Breaking news. Here's the news. Breaking news. Young man on acid realizes that matter is only energy slowed down to walking pace, and we are all one consciousness experiencing itself subjectively." And I think that was, considering it was a joke, because he then turned around, now over to Bill for the weather. I think that was one of the most profound statements, because if you look at all the major religions, it is always look for the God within. It is always the idea that everything is God. And for instance, the concept of the Or Ein Sof that we have within Kabbalah, we have the concept, similar concepts within Sufism. We also have the concept of Brahman within the Vedanta, which is the basis of the Hindu religion. We have a similar concept within Buddhism. So clearly, it is what Aldous Huxley called a perennial philosophy. It's the nugget that's in all religions worldwide, the Great Spirit. It's also within a lot of esoteric and occult belief systems as well. So for me, this idea that we are all one conscious experiencing it subjectively is very, very powerful. And indeed, I contributed a chapter to a book called Pandeism, an anthology, a few years ago, which has a series of essays putting forward the idea that pandeism, everything is God. You know, God is literally everything. And in my last book, I come up with a concept which I haven't touched on at all at the moment, where I call all of us that are living our life linearly in one life, I call eidolons. Then is something I call the daemon, which is our higher self, for want of a better term. But above that, I have something I call the Uberdaemon, which is based on the similar concept as the Jungian collective unconscious. And that effectively is the conscious awareness and experience of all humanity. So when people regress into past lives, I argue what you're doing is you're regressing within the Uberdaemon's memory fields. So you can experience other people's lives in other times and other histories. But I then say that above that, there is something called the Godaemon. And the Godaemon is effectively the consciousness of everything. Because, and for this final thing, Sir Julian Jaynes, who is a British astronomer, said that for many, many years we've believed that the universe is a great mechanism. The more we discover about quantum mechanics and cosmology, it's looking more and more like a great thought. And that great thought is God.
Ben?
So, I'm going to. So I mean, I'm only like a little over 30 years old. I've had a lot of really interesting life experiences, met a lot of really interesting people in my time, and boy oh boy, I feel way older than 31. But one of the really interesting things that I heard, and I've heard people say a lot of things, but one of the things that that always stuck in my head was sort of this interpretation of Aristotle through a guy named Gregory of Palamas, right? So he has this whole idea, which is really interesting, which is God is essence and energies, right? So essence, right, according to Aristotle, is everything has an essence, but we can't really know it, right? But the energies portion is, how one acts in the world, right? So, Matt, right? I know that you do paranormal, you do chemistry, you do all sorts of stuff, but I don't know your essence, right? I don't know you. I don't know that sort of portion of you that makes up yourself. I mean, same with my dad. I mean, I've lived with my dad, for a good portion of my life. But yet, I know my dad through how he acts in the world. I know him through his energies and how he interacts with everything, right? And I know him in a different way everybody else knows him. But I don't know his essence. And so we sort of can't really know the essence of it, but we know how God acts and exists and interfaces with things. We have a vague idea of it through our experiences. But really, at the end of the day, we can't know the essence. We do know the actions, perhaps, maybe. We have ideas, whether it's, quantum entanglement or, we use quantum physics to try and quantify things. But really, at the end of the day, we don't know the essence. We know the energies. So from where I come from, in a cultural aspect, that's kind of as close as you're going to get, is we have this idea that we won't really know, but we know how it acts, and we know how it exists in things. And we know that in some way, shape, or form, somehow we're all led to a certain point. I always kind of like the idea that was floated in Donnie Darko, of all things, where, you have this sort of little arrow that shoots out of you and kind of points you in directions that you're supposed to go. And there's I kind of like that, but it kind of got rid of the whole point of free will. I mean, but whatever, that's a whole other thing. If you want to get into Taoism, we could do that, but we don't really have a ton of time for that. But the idea of there being this sort of energy that exists in the world, right? How something acts, how we all act and interact with our environment, it's the same sort of deal. And so, just like you all can't know my essence, I can't know your essence. We can't know a cosmic being's essence.
Okay, I can't believe we covered that. But just briefly, from my own point of view, after a lifetime of studying theology, formally, and philosophy, not to mention the paranormal experiences, I long ago reached a very, very simple approach. It's best summed up in the Old Testament, 1 Kings of all places, where God was not in the storm, and all these things were happening, God was not there. God was in the still, small voice. And I think in the end, especially as I get older and face some health challenges, my opinion has not changed. It's strengthened. In the end, we stand naked before God, just us, whatever or whoever God may be. And I think to follow the commandment that love God with whatever you conceive, love Him with all He shared with them, with all your heart, with all your mind, and all your soul. That's it. So.
Well said, Father.
That's the most stimulating conversation I have been involved with in years, I think.
And we actually got to it.
I can't believe it. Thank you all so much. Hang out if you can, so we can chat after the show. But, Ben, let's take our announcements.
Yes, sir. Well, we got through all of it. We fought the good fight. Good job, everybody. Round of applause for us all. You can visit our show website, behindtheparanormal.com, where you can find our nearly 1,200 hours of regular shows and special broadcasts since 2008 from CBS Radio, Achieve Radio, and here on WOON, AM and FM Radio. Many thanks to our benevolent station manager, Dave Richards.
Absolutely, I was going to say that he deserves.
He put this all together for us, and it's been he's after all these years with Dave, he has been a magician. He has made things
amazing.
Happen. Yeah. And he's taught me a lot too. And he's gotten us through so many remote broadcasts. If anyone has ever been to the Exeter UFO Festival, you will know how stressed out I get. And all my hair loss is pretty much almost entirely from that event. But thank God for Dave, because he gets me through it every time. But you can also hear many of those broadcasts and these and all of the broadcasts that we have done on major podcast platforms, including iTunes, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube, even Spotify. You can find us on there as well.
And certainly this particular show, the 2-hour special, will, I hope the podcast apps got the memo. This is going to be 2 hours and not one.
Yeah, it'll be fine. Maybe.
Yeah, so anyway,
the
video will be posted later today. That's available on the station website here. And the audio will be posted to the major platforms sometime tomorrow.
So I guess I'll
Well, I want to mention the charities.
Oh, yes, please.
Yes, on behindtheparanormal.com is our charity page. Please consider these charities, because we know those who run them personally. And there are veterans charities, children's charities, historical charities, and please consider donating or doing whatever you can. Okay. Anyone have any final thought for about 10 seconds here? I guess
just
not.
to say thank you for inviting us. We're deeply honoured.
Yeah.
You've decided to have us of all your guests on your 1,000th show, and that is just wonderful. Thank you. I'm deeply honoured.
Well,
of all the real people you could have had, you had us holograms on. I'm just.
No, I think it was a tremendous mix. Okay, so, all right, next week, what's going on next week, Ben?
Well, now, so next week we start our new millennium. with an open line show, of course, to get to all the questions that we did not ask on this show. And maybe they won't be distillations of things that we get all the time. But we have many questions that we never get a chance to answer. There's mountains and mountains of them. So for anybody who's been waiting patiently for us over these 1,000 shows,
Yeah.
maybe we'll get to yours. There's a chance.
And then thanks too to our listeners who sent the questions in that we're able to boil down, ultimate or otherwise.
Indeed.
So we leave you today with a thought from the ancient Greek historian Polybius: the strong mind hopes and always has cause to hope. I'm Paul Eno.
And I'm Ben Eno. And thank you for listening to our 1,000th show, our 15th year on the air. Many thanks to all of those who participated today. Anyone who's participating by listening, feel free to listen to the show as many times as you like, especially since Anthony has a voice that can put you to sleep. Although his... I actually didn't...
It wakes me up.
Yeah, I know. It's honestly very stimulating. But I'm Ben Eno, and thanks for joining us on our great cosmic journey. And we shall see you next time on Behind the Paranormal.
Return to this radio frequency 167 hours from now for another edition of Behind the Paranormal with Paul and Ben Eno.
This classic edition of Casey Kasem's American Top 40 is from June 12, 1982.
In Hollywood, this is Casey Kasem on American Top 40, and we're counting down the hottest records in the nation on our way to the most popular song in America.
Number 31.
Here's the British-American group Foreigner with the follow-up to their recent hit, Jukebox Hero. It's from the same album, Foreigner 4. Up 4 notches this week to 31. Break It Up by Foreigner.